a desperate father, a dangerous loan shark, and a loyal dog who defies the odds to save a baby abandoned by the river. But why was this innocent child targeted? And how far will the shadows of the past reach to threaten his future? Stay with us to uncover a story of courage, redemption, and a bond that changes everything. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The storm rolled in fast, thick clouds swallowing the Appalachian skies as thunder rumbled through the valleys. Wyatt Hensley gripped the wheel of his battered pickup truck, its old engine growling against the rough dirt road. Rain slapped against the windshield, blurring his view of the narrow path ahead. Inside the cab, the air was suffocating, heavy with the weight of his thoughts. On the dashboard, a faded photograph of his late wife fluttered slightly with each bump in the road. Her smile was warm, frozen in a moment of happiness that now felt like a cruel joke. Wyatt's chest tightened as he glanced at it, guilt rising like the storm clouds outside. "I'm sorry, Anna." His voice cracked, barely audible over the rain. In the passenger seat, a small bundle stirred, a baby, no more than 6 months old. Sawyer cooed softly, his tiny fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. Wyatt's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel tighter, his mind warring with itself. Clay Maddox's threats echoed in his ears. "If you don't pay up, I'll take something you can't replace." Wyatt shuddered, his stomach churning at the memory of the loan shark's cold, menacing eyes. The truck skidded slightly as he turned onto an even narrower path leading to the riverbank. He slowed, the tires crunching on wet gravel, until the vehicle stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and Sawyer's gentle breaths. Wyatt exhaled shakily, turning to face the baby. "You deserve better than this," he whispered, his voice trembling. He lifted Sawyer into his arms, the warmth of the child's small body cutting through the cold despair that clung to him. He stepped out into the storm, his boots sinking into the mud as he approached the river. The water churned violently, swollen by the rain, threatening to spill over its banks. He laid a blanket on the ground, creating a makeshift crib nestled beneath a tree. The branches offered little shelter, but it was all he had. "Forgive me," Wyatt choked, his voice breaking. He pressed a kiss to Sawyer's forehead before placing him gently in the cradle of blankets. "I love you. Always." The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry that pierced through the rain. Wyatt staggered back, his hands trembling. He turned toward the truck, his every step heavy with regret. His chest heaved as he reached the door, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But he couldn't look back. He didn't trust himself to walk away if he did. The engine roared to life, and with one last glance at the riverbank, Wyatt drove off into the night. The red glow of his taillights disappeared into the storm. Sawyer's cries grew louder, lost in the roar of the rain and the angry rush of the river. From the shadows of the forest, a pair of sharp ears twitched. A figure emerged, a German shepherd, limping slightly as it approached. The dog's fur was matted with mud, its once proud stance diminished by a noticeable injury to its hind leg. Yet its eyes burned with intelligence and purpose. Ranger. Drawn by the sound of the baby's cries, Ranger hobbled closer. He sniffed the air, his instincts guiding him. The storm raged on, but the dog didn't hesitate. He reached the crib, nudging Sawyer gently with his nose. A sudden splash drew Ranger's attention. The river was rising, the water creeping closer to the baby. Ranger barked, the sound sharp and commanding, but it only seemed to agitate the storm. Then, a movement in the shadows. Yellow eyes glinted in the darkness, and a low growl rose above the storm. A coyote slinked closer, its teeth bared as it sized up the vulnerable child. Ranger stepped forward, his body tense despite his injury. He bared his teeth, a growl rumbling from deep within his chest. The coyote hesitated, its ears flicking back. With a sudden burst of energy, Ranger lunged forward, snapping his jaws. The predator yelped and darted back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Ranger turned back to Sawyer, his breathing heavy. The river was nearly at the baby's feet now, the water lapping hungrily at the edges of the blanket. Without hesitation, Ranger grabbed the edge of the crib with his teeth. Despite his injured leg, he pulled Sawyer to safety, dragging him away from the encroaching flood. The baby's cries softened as Ranger paused, his ears swiveling. He stared into the woods, the faint glow of headlights in the distance catching his attention. Humans, but not the right ones. Ranger sniffed the air again, a low growl escaping his throat. He shifted his weight, nudging Sawyer further from the riverbank before lifting him carefully by the blanket. His steps were slow but determined as he disappeared into the dense forest. The storm continued to rage, but Ranger moved with purpose, his injured leg barely slowing him down. Behind them, the riverbank was empty, save for the muddy tracks of Wyatt's truck fading into the night. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and rain, the storm pressing hard against everything beneath it. Ranger trudged forward, his injured leg buckling slightly with each step. The weight of Sawyer, swaddled in a damp blanket, hung in his jaws. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but the baby's soft whimpers urged him onward. Lightning splintered the sky, illuminating the towering pines that surrounded them. For a fleeting moment, the silhouette of a bear loomed in the distance, its massive frame shifting between the trees. Ranger froze, his ears pricking forward, his body rigid. The bear snorted, turning its head in their direction as thunder cracked overhead. Ranger growled low in his throat, his injured leg trembling as he shifted to shield Sawyer from the beast. The bear advanced a step, sniffing the air, but the storm was on Ranger's side. Another crack of thunder startled the creature, and with a final huff, it lumbered back into the darkness. The dog waited, his breath coming in labored pants, before nudging Sawyer closer against his chest. He crouched low, dragging the baby through the underbrush until they reached a rocky incline. Higher ground. Ranger knew it instinctively, training embedded in him long before he was abandoned. Sawyer stirred, his tiny hands waving weakly from the folds of the blanket. A soft coo escaped his lips, cutting through the relentless drumming of rain. Ranger paused, his sharp eyes scanning the woods around them, and lowered his head to nuzzle the baby. Sawyer giggled, oblivious to the dangers surrounding him, his bright laughter filling the stormy void. Ranger's nose twitched, catching a faint, promising scent. Smoke. His tired eyes narrowed, and as lightning flashed again, he caught a glimpse of a dim, flickering light far ahead. A cabin. Shelter. He grunted softly, adjusting his grip on the blanket, and began the painstaking journey toward the glow. Inside the small cabin, Maren Adkins bent over an injured rabbit nestled in her lap. The animal shivered as she dabbed its wound with a damp cloth. "There you go, little guy," she murmured, her voice soft and soothing. "You're safe now." The storm rattled the window panes, the noise causing the rabbit to twitch nervously. Maren frowned, her fingers brushing over its fur. "It's just the wind," she said, more to herself than the rabbit. "Nothing's going to hurt you here." Outside, a faint whimper reached her ears. She stiffened, tilting her head toward the sound. "Dad!" she called, standing abruptly. "Did you hear that?" Zeke Adkins, seated at the table sharpening an old hunting knife, didn't look up. "Probably just the wind," he replied gruffly. "No," Maren insisted, moving toward the window. "It sounded like..." She squinted into the rain, her breath fogging the glass. Her heart skipped a beat as she spotted movement, a dog dragging something behind it. She didn't wait for her father's permission. Grabbing a lantern, she threw open the door, the storm slamming into her with ferocity. "Maren!" Zeke barked, rising from his chair, but Maren was already running toward the porch, her boots splashing through puddles. "It's a dog!" she cried, kneeling as Ranger collapsed onto the wooden steps, his sides heaving. She gasped as she noticed the bundle in his jaws. "It's a baby!" Zeke appeared behind her, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his face hardened as he scanned the tree line. "We don't know where they came from," he said sharply. They need help, Marin shot back, wrapping the blanket more securely around Sawyer. The baby blinked up at her, his eyes wide and curious despite the cold. Zeke hesitated, the tension in his jaw visible even in the dim light. "Fine," he muttered finally, stepping aside to let them in. "But this doesn't feel right." Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire cast flickering shadows against the walls. Marin carefully laid Sawyer on the couch, her hands trembling as she checked him for injuries. "He's freezing," she whispered, wrapping a thicker blanket around him. Ranger slumped near the hearth, his injured leg stretched awkwardly to the side. Zeke knelt beside him, his experienced hands running along the dog's matted fur. "Looks like he's been through hell," he murmured. His fingers brushed against the frayed leash still hanging from Ranger's neck. "He's not just any dog," Marin said, watching as Ranger lifted his head to glance at Sawyer. "He must have been trained. Look at how he's protecting the baby." Zeke nodded grimly, but remained skeptical. "Doesn't explain where they came from, or who might be looking for them." At the edge of the room, Marin met Ranger's eyes and smiled faintly. "You're a hero," she whispered. "I think I'll call you Ranger." The dog's ears twitched at the name, and for a moment, his tail gave a weak wag. Zeke stood abruptly, moving toward the window. His sharp eyes scanned the darkness, the faint outline of boot prints in the mud catching his attention. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice low and tense. Marin frowned. "What do you mean?" "Tracks," Zeke replied, gripping his rifle tighter. "Whoever they belong to, they're not far." Thunder rumbled again, and Zeke's gaze remained fixed on the woods. The storm had masked their arrival, but the danger was far from over. Morning broke reluctantly over the storm-drenched forest. The pale light of dawn filtered through the lingering mist. Zeke Adkins stood on the cabin's porch, his broad shoulders hunched as he scanned the tree line. The storm had passed, but its remnants clung to the air, heavy and damp. His rifle hung loosely in his grip, a silent warning to anyone or anything that might emerge from the woods. Inside, the atmosphere was warmer, though no less tense. Marin rocked Sawyer gently in her arms, humming a soft lullaby. The baby cooed, his tiny fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. Nearby, Ranger lay stretched out on the floor, his injured paw resting awkwardly. He watched Marin with quiet eyes, the edges of his fur still damp from the storm. "You're such a good boy," Marin whispered as she crouched beside him, inspecting his wound. Her hands moved gently, cleaning the torn skin with warm water and a scrap of cloth. Ranger flinched at first, but as Marin continued to murmur soothing words, he began to relax. Sawyer let out a delighted giggle, reaching a chubby hand toward Ranger. The dog responded by licking the baby's fingers, eliciting more laughter. Marin smiled faintly, the tension in her chest easing for the first time since last night. "He likes you," she said softly, scratching behind Ranger's ears. "And I think you like him too." The moment of calm was interrupted by a noise from the woods, a distant rustle of leaves, followed by the crunch of boots on wet earth. Zeke's posture stiffened. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice gruff. Before Marin could respond, the door creaked open and Zeke stepped out. He raised the rifle as a figure stumbled into view, disheveled and desperate. "Wait!" the man called out, raising his hands. "Please, I'm not here to hurt anyone." Zeke's grip on the rifle tightened. "Don't come any closer." The man stopped, his chest heaving. His clothes were soaked, and mud streaked his boots. There was a wildness in his eyes, guilt, fear, and something else entirely. "I'm looking for my son," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, is he here?" Marin appeared in the doorway, clutching Sawyer protectively. "Dad," she said cautiously, "I think he's telling the truth." Zeke glanced at her, his expression hard. "You don't know that. For all we know, he's the one who put that baby in danger." The man dropped to his knees. "I did," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. I'm the one who left him. But I made a mistake. Please, he's all I have left. Zeke stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. What kind of man abandons his own child? The words hit like a hammer, and the man flinched. I didn't want to, he choked out. But I was desperate. Clay Maddox. He said he'd kill me if I didn't pay him back. I thought maybe someone would find him and take better care of him than I could. His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. Coward, Zeke muttered, lowering the rifle slightly. You don't deserve to be a father. Stop it! Marin's voice cut through the tension. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing. He's here now. He came back for his son. That has to mean something. Zeke glared at her but said nothing. The man looked up, his face pale and streaked with rain and tears. My name's Wyatt, he said quietly, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Marin glanced at Zeke. Dad, you know what it's like to make a mistake and wish you could undo it. Give him a chance. The words struck a nerve. Zeke's expression darkened, and his grip on the rifle tightened. Memories he'd buried long ago began to resurface. Flames consuming a house, the cries of a family he couldn't save, and the unbearable weight of losing his own wife and daughter in the same fire. This isn't about me, he snapped, turning away. No, but it's about him. Marin pointed to Sawyer, who stared at Wyatt with wide, curious eyes. Slowly, the baby reached out a tiny hand toward his father. Wyatt hesitated, his breath hitching. Tentatively, he took a step closer, sinking to his knees beside Marin. Hey, buddy, he whispered, his voice trembling. It's me, Sawyer cooed, his fingers brushing against Wyatt's hand. The man let out a shuddering breath, tears falling freely. I'm so sorry, he murmured. I'll never leave you again. I promise. Zeke watched the scene, his jaw clenched. He turned away, moving to the window to scan the tree line. Something wasn't right. The faint impression of boot prints in the mud confirmed his suspicions. Clay Maddox, or one of his men, had been here. We're not safe, Zeke said sharply, breaking the moment. If Maddox is tracking this baby, he'll find this place. Marin stiffened, her eyes darting to the door. What do we do? Zeke grabbed a hammer from the wall and began reinforcing the windows. We prepare, and we don't let our guard down for a second. Ranger growled low in his throat, his ears twitching toward the woods. The storm might have passed, but danger was closing in. The town was still waking up, the sun casting a soft golden light over the Appalachian foothills. Detective Iris Monroe sat at her desk, the room bathed in the muted hum of fluorescent lights. Before her lay a series of photographs. Sawyer's face smiled back from a grainy snapshot, his tiny features innocent and unknowing. Iris rubbed her temples, exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes. She leaned back, letting out a deep sigh, and glanced at the photo pinned to the corner of her desk. Her own son, Mason, grinned in his Little League uniform, the blue cap askew on his head. The image was both a comfort and a painful reminder of the vulnerability she fought to protect every day. Flipping open a folder, Iris refocused. Sawyer Hensley, missing, likely abandoned. She'd been here before. Cases like this always weighed heavier on her, the line between professional resolve and personal empathy blurring. She promised herself, as she always did, that she wouldn't let this one slip through the cracks. Iris stood at the muddy riverbank, the place where Sawyer had been left behind. The storm had washed away most of the evidence, but faint imprints in the earth caught her attention. Baby blankets, waterlogged and smeared with dirt, were scattered near the edge. Squatting down, she ran her fingers over a faint set of tracks in the mud. Dog prints. They weren't large, but they were distinct, crossing over the area where the crib had been set. She frowned, her mind racing. A dog's involvement was unusual. Did it belong to someone? Or was it a stray drawn to the baby's cries? Detective Monroe! Iris turned to see the sheriff approaching, his broad frame clad in a rain-slicked jacket. You've got people talking, he said, offering a nod toward the group of townsfolk gathered a distance away, their murmurs audible even over the rush of the river. Iris straightened. "They should be talking," she replied, her tone firm. "A baby doesn't just disappear without leaving ripples." The small town buzzed with speculation. At the diner, over steaming cups of coffee, locals debated the story. Some saw Wyatt as a victim of his own misfortune, a man beaten down by life, struggling to make impossible choices. Others were less forgiving, condemning him as a coward who'd abandoned his responsibility. That evening, the church hosted a vigil for Sawyer. Candlelight flickered against stained glass as voices rose in solemn prayer. Iris stood at the back, her hands in her coat pockets. She listened to the whispers of hope and despair, the town's collective grief mingling with her own memories of loss. Wyatt Hensley sat at the sheriff's station, his face a mask of regret. His hands, calloused and trembling, fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. Across the table, Iris watched him closely, her sharp gaze missing nothing. "You left him there," she said, her voice steady but cutting. Wyatt nodded, his head hung low. I thought it was the only way," he murmured, his voice hoarse. I didn't want him to get hurt." "By who?" Iris pressed, leaning forward. "Who were you running from, Wyatt?" His lips tightened, his eyes darting toward the mirrored glass of the interrogation room. "I can't," he whispered. "If I say anything, they'll kill me." Iris's jaw clenched. "If you don't say anything, I can't protect you, or your son." The mention of Sawyer seemed to pierce through Wyatt's fear. He looked up, his eyes rimmed red. "Clay Maddox," he said finally, the name falling from his lips like a confession. Clay Maddox paced the dimly lit room of his hideout, his thick fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey. The man before him, pale and shaking, stammered out apologies. "I didn't mean to say anything, boss. I swear." Clay silenced him with a cold glare. "You think apologies keep me safe?" he growled. He gestured to one of his enforcers, who stepped forward menacingly. "Make sure he remembers who he works for." The enforcer dragged the man from the room, leaving Clay alone. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his mind already moving to the next step. The kid was still out there, and if the authorities got too close, his operation would crumble. He couldn't let that happen. Back in her office, Iris pored over reports. Wyatt's confession had opened a new trail, one that led straight to Clay Maddox. Her gut told her he was the key to everything. But without solid evidence, her hands were tied. She picked up the phone to call her son. "Hi, sweetie," she said, her voice softening. "Did you finish your homework?" "Yeah, Mom," Mason replied, his voice cheerful. "Are you coming home soon?" She hesitated, her heart tugging at his words. "Not tonight, bud. I've got a big case." Mason's sigh was audible even through the line. "Okay, good luck, Mom." As the call ended, Iris stared at the screen, her own reflection staring back. She thought of Sawyer, alone and vulnerable, and of Mason, safe, but still longing for her presence. The parallel cut deep. Late that night, as Iris sifted through her notes, the phone rang. She answered briskly, her voice firm. "Detective Monroe," a gruff voice rasped on the other end. "You're poking your nose where it doesn't belong." Her stomach tightened. "Who is this? Back off, or you'll regret it." The line went dead, leaving Iris clutching the receiver in silence. She exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. "No one threatens my case," she muttered. The cabin awoke under a grey morning sky, the weight of the storm's passing still heavy in the damp air. The creak of old floorboards announced Zeke's movements as he carefully placed logs in the fireplace, his eyes flicking toward Wyatt. Tension hung thick as Wyatt, seated at the worn wooden table, busied himself with feeding Sawyer spoonfuls of mashed oats. Zeke kept his gaze sharp, every action Wyatt made scrutinized. Ranger, resting at Wyatt's feet, thumped his tail against the floor whenever Sawyer giggled. The loyalty of the dog, so instinctual and unyielding, gnawed at Zeke's resolve to stay guarded. "Breakfast is ready." Maren's voice broke the quiet, carrying warmth as she set down plates of eggs and toast. She offered a soft smile to Wyatt, who muttered a quiet thanks. Wyatt's gaze shifted to Ranger, whose watchful eyes conveyed a silent trust. The German shepherd had chosen to remain near him, nuzzling Sawyer protectively. It was as if Ranger sensed the undercurrent of Wyatt's desperation. "Smart dog," Zeke muttered, his tone begrudging. Wyatt looked up, unsure if the comment was meant for him or the room. "Yeah," he said softly, "smarter than I deserve." Later that morning, as the cabin bustled with quiet activity, Wyatt found himself cornered by Maren in the kitchen. "You need to tell him," she said firmly, her expression a blend of determination and compassion. Wyatt hesitated. "Tell him what? That I made a deal with the devil?" "Yes," she replied, her voice unwavering. "If you want him to trust you, you have to start by being honest." Maren's words stayed with him. Hours later, as Zeke and Wyatt worked side by side patching a hole in the cabin's outer wall, Wyatt broke his silence. "I need to explain," Wyatt began, his voice faltering. He recounted his descent into debt after his wife's death, how Clay Maddox had offered a lifeline, only to tighten the noose around his neck. Zeke listened in stony silence, his hands gripping the hammer with white-knuckled tension. "And you thought abandoning your kid was the answer," he finally snapped, the accusation cutting. Wyatt swallowed hard. I thought I could keep him safe, that if I stayed, Clay would..." His voice broke. "It was a mistake, the worst one of my life." The admission hung in the air like the lingering chill of the storm. That evening, Zeke sat alone on the porch, his rifle balanced across his knees. The quiet of the forest was deceptive, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves. His thoughts turned inward, to a memory he had spent years trying to bury. The fire had raged, consuming the old apartment building faster than he could fight it. He could still hear the screams, a young mother trapped in the upper floors, her child cradled in her arms. Zeke had chosen to rescue another family instead, leaving her behind. Now, with Wyatt pleading for redemption and a baby's life once again at risk, Zeke couldn't ignore the parallels. Inside, Maren tucked Sawyer into the makeshift crib they'd fashioned from an old trunk. She ran her fingers through his soft curls, humming a lullaby. Behind her, Ranger stood guard, his ears twitching at the faintest noise. Wyatt watched from the doorway, his heart aching at the scene. Maren turned to him, her voice gentle. "You're not the same man who made that choice at the river. Prove it." "I will," Wyatt vowed. In the forest, Clay Maddox was closing in. His men, armed and methodical, scoured the trails for signs of Wyatt and Sawyer. They found tracks, boot prints, and evidence of a dog's presence. One of the men lit a cigarette, the acrid smoke curling upward as they plotted their next move. Clay's voice was low and menacing. "They're close. Let's remind them what happens when they cross me." The cabin's defenses were strengthened that night. Wyatt and Zeke worked together, setting crude traps and reinforcing the doors. Despite their uneasy alliance, there was a flicker of understanding between them, a recognition of shared burdens. "I still don't trust you," Zeke admitted as they secured a bar across the back door. "But for that kid's sake, I hope you prove me wrong." "I will," Wyatt said again, the words carrying more weight this time. Ranger's growl pierced the stillness of the cabin, a low rumble that set everyone on edge. Zeke grabbed his rifle, motioning for silence. Maren peeked out the window, her breath catching. "Someone's been here," she whispered, pointing to fresh boot prints in the mud near the tree line. Zeke nodded grimly. "They're watching us." The group huddled inside, their breaths shallow, as they awaited whatever came next. Sawyer stirred in his crib, a soft whimper escaping his lips. Maren gently shushed him, stroking his cheek. And then it came, a knock at the door. Deliberate, loud. Zeke raised his rifle, his jaw tightening. "Stay quiet," he hissed, his eyes locked on the door as the knock sounded again. The sound of the knock hung in the air, loud and deliberate, sending a ripple of unease through the cabin. Maren clutched Sawyer tightly, her heart pounding as she retreated to the back room with Ranger, the dog's low growl vibrating through the quiet. Zeke stood near the door, his rifle raised and his expression grim. Wyatt pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow and his hands trembling as if he were reliving every poor decision that had led them here. The knock came again, louder this time. Zeke signaled for silence, his finger resting on the trigger as he eased the door open just enough to peer outside. Through the crack, Zeke saw a figure illuminated by the dim light of a storm lantern, Clay Maddox. Flanked by two hulking henchmen, Clay offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Evening," Clay drawled, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Sorry to bother you, friend. I'm looking for something that belongs to me." Zeke's jaw tightened. "You're trespassing. Get off my land." Clay's grin widened. "Well now, I don't mean no harm. Just looking for a man and his boy. Seems they've wandered off." His tone turned sharp. "Sure you haven't seen anything unusual?" Zeke didn't flinch. "Haven't seen a thing. Now leave." Clay's eyes narrowed, the thin veneer of civility slipping. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Inside, Maren peered through a side window, her grip on Sawyer firm as she whispered soothing words to calm his whimpers. Ranger stood at her side, his hackles raised. Wyatt, crouched behind a cabinet, clenched his fists. Every instinct told him to run. Clay's voice alone was enough to freeze him in place. But when he glanced at Sawyer, the baby's tiny fingers gripping Maren's shirt, something inside him shifted. He began to rise, intent on surrendering, but Zeke's sharp whisper stopped him. "Running won't protect him," Zeke growled. "Stand your ground, for once." The words stung, but they held truth. Wyatt swallowed hard, his trembling subsiding as he nodded silently. Clay, growing impatient, pulled a pistol from his belt and fired a shot into the air. The sound cracked through the forest like a whip, making Maren jump and Sawyer cry out. Zeke didn't hesitate. He stepped fully onto the porch, his rifle aimed squarely at Clay. "Last warning," he said, his voice cold and steady. "This is private property. Leave, or I'll make you." One of Clay's henchmen shifted uneasily, but Clay didn't budge. "You've got guts, old man," he sneered. "Let's see how far they get you." As the standoff continued, the second henchman circled the cabin, slipping through the shadows until he found an unlocked side window. He forced it open, the creak of wood barely audible over the distant rustle of leaves. Inside, Ranger stiffened, his growl turning into a bark that echoed through the cabin. Maren turned, her eyes widening as she saw the intruder hoisting himself through the window. Grabbing the nearest object, a cast iron pan, she swung with all her might, striking the man's arm. He cursed, dropping his flashlight as he stumbled inside. Before Maren could strike again, Wyatt rushed forward, tackling the henchman to the ground. It was a clumsy, desperate move, but Wyatt's determination outweighed his lack of finesse. They grappled, Wyatt managing to wrest the man's gun away before Zeke burst into the room, his rifle aimed. "Enough!" Zeke barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The henchman froze, raising his hands as Zeke motioned for him to back away. Outside, Clay's head jerked toward the cabin at the sound of the commotion. "Looks like you've got company," Zeke called out, his rifle still trained on the retreating henchman. Clay scowled, his earlier confidence faltering. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You can't protect him forever. I always collect what I'm owed." With a sharp whistle, he signaled to his men, and the three disappeared into the woods, their retreat marked by the crunch of boots on leaves. Inside the cabin, the group regrouped, their breaths heavy with adrenaline. Wyatt, bruised and shaken, checked on Sawyer, who reached for him with a gurgling laugh. Zeke watched the scene, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Not bad," he muttered, just loud enough for Wyatt to hear. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maren cradled Sawyer in her arms, her hands stroking Ranger's fur as she whispered, "We'll keep him safe. All of us." Zeke nodded, but his gaze shifted toward the tire tracks leading away from the cabin. His grip on the rifle tightened as he spoke. "This isn't over," he warned, his voice low and grave. "He'll be back, and next time, he won't just knock." The cabin stood resolute against the fading light of day, its occupants steeling themselves after the confrontation with Clay Maddox. The air inside was heavy, not only with the scent of wood smoke, but with the unspoken tension left in the wake of Clay's ominous threat. Miles away, Detective Iris Monroe sat in her cruiser, studying a map illuminated by the soft glow of her dashboard light. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention to a tip from a local. "They're up in the woods, ma'am," the man's gravelly voice rasped. "Saw Maddox and his boys heading toward that old Adkins place." Iris thanked him and hung up, her mind racing. Pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, each clue painting a clearer picture of Sawyer's peril, and of those who had risked everything to shield him. Her earlier investigation at the riverbank had revealed the faint imprint of dog tracks leading away from Wyatt's abandoned truck. The baby blankets and discarded bottle confirmed what her instincts already knew. Sawyer had been left there, vulnerable to the elements. But those tracks... Iris had seen enough cases to recognize the difference between an ordinary stray and an animal with purpose. Somewhere in these woods, a dog had taken on the role of a guardian, pulling Sawyer from the brink of tragedy. The thought both heartened and troubled her. What kind of desperation had driven Wyatt to abandon his own child? Earlier that day, Iris had tracked down one of Maddox's former associates, a wiry man with darting eyes who flinched at every noise. The man spoke reluctantly, clearly terrified of Clay's reach. "Wyatt didn't have a choice," he'd said, his voice trembling. "Maddox loaned him money, then bled him dry. Threatened his kid, his baby, if he didn't pay up." The man's words echoed in Iris's mind as she drove deeper into the woods. Her grip tightened on the wheel, not just from anger at Maddox's cruelty, but from a sharp pang of empathy for Wyatt. Iris knew all too well the pain of fighting to protect a child. Her own son's face flashed in her mind, his wide eyes filled with fear during the nights his father had walked out on them. "This case is different," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "This time, I can stop it before it's too late." Meanwhile, Clay Maddox paced a clearing in the woods, his anger simmering just below the surface. His failed attempt at the cabin had cost him time and men. "You let an old man and a washed-up coward get the better of you," Clay snarled at his remaining henchmen. He grabbed the nearest one by the collar, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. "Next time, I'll take care of it myself. You got that?" The man nodded frantically, his face pale. Clay released him with a shove, turning to the local tracker he'd coerced into aiding them. "Show me the quickest way back to that cabin," Clay ordered. "We're finishing this tonight." Iris parked her cruiser near a service road, the terrain too rough for anything but a hike. She slung her backpack over her shoulder, double-checking her firearm before locking the vehicle. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath her boots and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. As she approached the coordinates where Zeke's property was rumored to be, she stumbled upon the remnants of Clay's retreat: cigarette butts, tire tracks, and a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. "Getting sloppy," she muttered, crouching to examine the tracks. The discovery bolstered her determination. She was close, and so were they. As she moved cautiously through the trees, Iris overheard the low hum of voices crackling through a walkie-talkie. She froze, listening intently as fragments of conversation drifted toward her. "Wait for my signal. Cabin's just up ahead." Her heart raced. Clay and his crew were closing in. She ducked behind a tree, weighing her options. Calling for backup would take hours, and the storm rolling in threatened to cut off communications entirely. She pulled out her own radio, her voice steady as she relayed her position. "This is Detective Monroe. I've located Maddox and his men near the Adkins property. Immediate assistance requested." The reply crackled back with static, the dispatcher's voice tinged with concern. "Understood, Detective, but weather conditions are slowing response times. ETA for backup is 2 hours. 2 hours. Iris didn't have that kind of time. The cabin lights came into view through the dense trees, a beacon of fragile hope amidst the encroaching darkness. Iris took a deep breath, steadying herself. She thought of her son, of his laughter and his innocence, and how close Sawyer was to losing the same. "Not on my watch," she whispered, drawing her weapon as she edged closer. Movement caught her eye, a shadow slipping through the trees. Her pulse quickened as she saw Clay Maddox and his men advancing toward the cabin, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Iris tightened her grip, her resolve hardening. The storm was coming, both outside and within, and she would be ready. The night blanketed the forest in an oppressive darkness, the storm clouds above muting even the faintest light. Inside the cabin, every creak of the wooden floor felt magnified, each sound from the woods outside a harbinger of what was to come. Iris adjusted her grip on her sidearm as she quietly explained the situation to the others. "Clay Maddox isn't leaving without Sawyer," she said, her voice low but resolute. "He's ruthless, but if we work together, we have a chance to stop him." Zeke nodded, his expression grim. "Then we fight. We're not giving that baby up." Outside, Clay Maddox surveyed the cabin, a cruel smirk twisting his features. He'd underestimated the people inside once, but this time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. "Burn 'em out," he growled to one of his men, motioning toward the rain-soaked woodpile near the cabin. The henchman hesitated. "But boss, it's pouring." Clay's glare silenced him. "I didn't ask for excuses. Do it." Inside the cabin, Ranger let out a low growl, his ears pricked toward the back of the property. Zeke motioned for everyone to stay quiet as he peered through a crack in the barricaded window. "Fire," he muttered, spotting flickering flames creeping toward the cabin's edge. "They're trying to smoke us out." Wyatt stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I can help douse it. We've got to stop it before it spreads." "Fine," Zeke agreed, "but be quick and keep low." Wyatt and Zeke worked in tense silence, hauling water from the rain barrel to the encroaching fire. Each splash against the flames sent a hiss into the air, the sound mingling with the distant laughter of Clay's crew. Just as they extinguished the last embers, Ranger barked sharply, his growls growing louder. From the corner of his eye, Zeke spotted movement, a shadow slipping toward the cabin's rear window. "Ranger, stay back!" Zeke hissed, but the German Shepherd was already in motion. The intruder barely had time to react before Ranger lunged, his bark fierce and unrelenting. The man stumbled back, scrambling to escape the dog's snapping jaws. From inside the cabin, Maren gripped a cast-iron pan, her knuckles white. When the intruder managed to push Ranger aside momentarily, she swung the pan with all her strength, the clang echoing in the enclosed space. The man crumpled, dazed, as Ranger growled over him. Wyatt burst in moments later, using a length of rope to tie the henchman securely. You did good," Zeke admitted reluctantly, his tone gruff but sincere. Wyatt's shoulders straightened slightly, his fear momentarily replaced with pride. Outside, Clay's patience frayed. His voice cut through the night like a blade. "You think this is over? You've got a baby in there. How long do you think you can keep him safe?" Iris, crouched near the porch, signaled for Wyatt to follow her. "We can't let them trap us," she whispered. "If we don't draw them away, they'll overwhelm us." "What's the plan?" Wyatt asked, his voice shaky but resolute. "We create a diversion," Iris replied. "If we can take out a couple of them quietly, Zeke and Maren can hold the cabin." Wyatt hesitated, glancing back toward the baby's soft coos inside. Then he nodded. "Let's do it." Using the cover of darkness, Iris and Wyatt crept through the trees, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Iris motioned toward two of Clay's men standing near the tree line, their attention focused on the cabin. With precision, Iris incapacitated one, her movements swift and efficient. Wyatt, though less graceful, managed to tackle the second, wrestling him to the ground and securing his weapon. "Not bad," Iris muttered, a faint smirk breaking her usually stoic demeanor. Inside the cabin, Zeke held his ground as Clay's remaining men launched a frontal assault. Gunfire echoed through the woods, splintering the air with sharp cracks. Maren crouched near the back room with Sawyer, her arms wrapped protectively around him. Ranger stayed by her side, his ears pinned back, ready to defend at a moment's notice. Through the chaos, Sawyer giggled, his tiny hands reaching for Ranger's fur. Maren managed a soft smile, her voice trembling as she whispered, "We're going to be okay, little one. I promise." As the group inside began to gain the upper hand, the storm outside intensified. Rain battered the roof and thunder rolled ominously. But amidst the downpour, Clay Maddox found his opportunity. A weakened side window, damaged during the earlier intrusion, gave way as Clay forced himself inside. His presence was immediate and commanding, his gun raised as he stepped toward Maren and Sawyer. "One wrong move," he growled, grabbing Maren by the arm and yanking her upright. "And she's gone." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down like the storm outside. The air inside the cabin was electric with tension. The muffled storm outside a distant hum compared to the pounding of hearts within. Clay Maddox's hand gripped Maren's arm like a vice, his gun trained unflinchingly on her head. "Hand over the baby," Clay hissed, his voice cold and venomous. "Or she doesn't walk out of here." Zeke stood a few feet away, rifle aimed steadily at Clay, his eyes burning with defiance. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice measured but firm. "You leave now, and you might just walk out alive." Clay barked a humorless laugh. "You think I'm bluffing? This is business, old man. You've got one chance to make it right." Maren's knees wobbled, but her spirit held firm. She glanced down at Sawyer, who was nestled in a makeshift crib just a few feet away. The child's cries broke through the suffocating silence, his small arms reaching for her. Her voice, though trembling, cut through the air like a blade. "You can take me, but you'll never lay a hand on that child again." Clay's sneer faltered for a fraction of a second, his focus momentarily drawn to Sawyer's cries. It was all the time Wyatt needed. Wyatt, who had been frozen near the wall, suddenly lunged. His tackle knocked Clay off balance, sending them both crashing to the floor. The gun clattered across the room as the two men grappled, each fighting with a desperation born of their own demons. Clay landed a solid punch to Wyatt's side, and Wyatt groaned in pain but didn't let go. His hands found Clay's wrist, twisting it until the older man roared in pain and released his grip. "You're not taking him!" Wyatt yelled, his voice hoarse and raw. Zeke didn't waste a second. With a speed that belied his age, he grabbed the discarded weapon and leveled it at Clay, forcing the man to his knees. "This ends now," Zeke growled, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of regret and resolve. "You've preyed on the weak long enough, not anymore." Clay's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think this is over? I've got people everywhere, you can't stop me." Before Zeke could respond, the cabin door burst open. Iris Monroe stepped inside, her gun drawn, her presence commanding. She surveyed the scene in an instant, her sharp eyes landing on Clay. "Clay Maddox," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "You're under arrest." Clay's henchmen were nowhere to be seen, incapacitated by Iris's earlier efforts. Now, Clay himself was dragged to his feet, his hands forced behind his back as Iris cuffed him. "You think you've won?" Clay snarled as she read him his rights. "This isn't over, I'll be out before you know it." Iris didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." Inside the cabin, the group finally allowed themselves to exhale. Wyatt leaned heavily against the wall, clutching his side where Clay had struck him. Blood seeped from a shallow graze on his arm, but his eyes were fixed on Sawyer. As if sensing his father's pain, Sawyer reached for Wyatt, his tiny fingers curling around his shirt. Wyatt's shoulders sagged, a mix of exhaustion and relief washing over him as he pulled his son close. "I'm so sorry," Wyatt whispered, his voice breaking. "I'll never let anything happen to you again." Zeke approached, his rifle slung over his shoulder. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, their earlier animosity giving way to mutual respect. "You proved yourself tonight," Zeke said gruffly. "Keep it up." Wyatt nodded, his grip on Sawyer tightening. Nearby, Maren knelt beside Ranger, her hands gently stroking his fur. The dog, though visibly exhausted, leaned into her touch, his tail wagging faintly. "You saved us, boy," Maren murmured, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're a hero." As the group regrouped, Iris stood watch at the window, her gaze scanning the darkened forest. The storm had lessened, but the tension lingered. "Clay's behind bars," she said, turning to the others. "But his network isn't gone. They'll come looking eventually." Zeke's expression hardened. "We'll be ready." The group shared a quiet moment of unity, the flickering light of the cabin casting long shadows on the walls. Sawyer giggled as he clung to Ranger, his laughter a beacon of hope amidst the chaos. For now, they had won, but they all knew the fight wasn't over. Morning broke gently over the Appalachian Mountains, sunlight streaming through the remnants of storm clouds. The once chaotic cabin now stood battered, but resilient, much like the people inside. Zeke stepped onto the porch, breathing deeply as the cool air filled his lungs. His eyes scanned the forest, alert to any movement. The events of the night before were etched in his mind, but the light of day offered a fleeting sense of peace. Inside the cabin, the group began to stir. Maren carried Sawyer in her arms, bouncing him softly as she sang a quiet tune. The baby's laughter echoed, a stark contrast to the tense silence of the previous night. Wyatt sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Bandages wrapped around his arm, a visible reminder of his efforts to protect his son. Maren joined him, placing Sawyer in his lap. "You saved him," she said gently. "That's all that matters now." Wyatt looked up, his eyes clouded with doubt. "I don't know if I deserve to be his father after everything I've done." Maren's voice softened, but carried conviction. "We all make mistakes, Wyatt, but Sawyer doesn't need you to be perfect. He just needs you to try." Zeke entered, wiping his hands on a rag after checking the perimeter. The storm didn't leave much damage, but we've got some work to do. Without hesitation, Wyatt stood. "I'll help." The two men exchanged a silent nod, their earlier animosity replaced with a budding respect. Together, they began repairing the broken window, their movements steady and purposeful. Iris, seated near the fireplace, reviewed her notes. She glanced up, her sharp eyes softened by a hint of admiration as she watched the group working together. "You all make a good team," she remarked. Zeke grunted in response. Necessity makes people learn fast. As the morning progressed, a knock at the door startled the group. Zeke approached cautiously, rifle in hand. When he opened the door, relief washed over him. It was Clara Henshaw, a neighbor from a cabin farther down the mountain. "I heard about the little one," Clara said warmly, holding out a basket of fresh bread and preserves. "Thought you could use some help." Behind her, several other neighbors approached, carrying supplies and offering words of support. The small act of kindness brought a lump to Wyatt's throat, reminding him of the community he'd feared he had lost. That evening, the cabin's atmosphere was lighter. A simple meal brought everyone together around the table. Sawyer sat in a makeshift high chair, giggling as Ranger performed a playful trick, balancing a biscuit on his nose before snapping it up. Wyatt watched the scene with quiet gratitude, his heart swelling as he saw his son surrounded by safety and love. Zeke raised his glass. "To surviving," he said gruffly, but there was a hint of warmth in his tone. "To family," Maren added, her smile radiant despite the exhaustion etched on her face. Iris chuckled. "And to the dog, who saved us all." The group laughed softly, the tension of the past days momentarily forgotten. Later, as the others cleaned up, Zeke approached Iris with a folded map. He spread it across the table, pointing to several locations marked with red circles. "These are places Clay used to operate," Zeke explained. "If he's got allies left, they'll be here." Iris nodded, her jaw tightening. I'll stick around until we're sure this area's clear. I won't let him or anyone else hurt this family again." Her words carried weight, but a shadow of unease lingered in her eyes. The night fell quietly, but Ranger's sudden growl shattered the stillness. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the window. Zeke grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, the wooden porch creaking beneath his boots. He scanned the tree line but saw no one. Then, faintly, he spotted them. Footprints leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the forest. Returning inside, Zeke's expression was grave. "We're not done yet." The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fleeting peace now overshadowed by the lingering presence of danger. The sun struggled to rise, its pale light barely breaking through the dense canopy of the Appalachian forest. Zeke stood at the edge of the cabin's property, rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning for anything out of place. The footprints they'd found the night before hadn't left his mind, and neither had the faint sense of unease that crept in with the morning fog. As he approached an old oak tree near the cabin's boundary, something caught his eye. A freshly carved symbol etched into the bark. It was simple, yet deliberate, an unmistakable mark used by Clay Maddox's crew. His jaw tightened, and he muttered under his breath, "They're marking their territory." Inside the cabin, Wyatt sat at the table, his hands trembling around a cup of coffee. The warmth of the drink didn't reach the chill in his chest. Across from him, Iris scribbled in her notebook, piecing together the clues they had so far. Maren played with Sawyer on the rug, her soft laughter a fragile reprieve from the tension. Wyatt cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I need to tell you something. About Clay. About why he's after me." Zeke entered just in time to hear the confession. His presence loomed in the small room as Wyatt began. "It wasn't just the debt," Wyatt admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Years ago, I got involved in one of his schemes. Smuggling, mostly. I was desperate for cash, but I backed out before the job was done. And Clay doesn't forgive debts or disloyalty." Zeke's eyes narrowed. "So, you brought this on yourself?" Wyatt's shoulders sagged. "I tried to stay out of his way, but when my wife died and the bills piled up, he saw an opportunity. He used Sawyer as leverage. I thought I could outsmart him, but I was wrong." Iris stepped in before Zeke's anger could escalate. "Wyatt's mistakes might have brought Clay here, but that doesn't change the fact that Maddox is the real threat. We need to focus on stopping him before anyone else gets hurt." Later that morning, Iris examined the carved symbol on the tree. It matched marks she'd seen in her previous investigations, a calling card of sorts, used by Clay's network to signal safe houses or targets. "This could lead us to his operation," she said, showing Zeke and Wyatt her findings. "If we can gather evidence at the nearest safe house, we might have enough to bring down his entire crew." "I'll go," Zeke said firmly. Wyatt hesitated, but nodded. "Me too." They prepared to leave, with Iris leading the way. Maren stayed behind to watch over Sawyer, her face tense but resolute. "Keep the door locked," Zeke instructed, his voice softening as he glanced at her. "We'll be back by nightfall." The journey to the safe house was fraught with unease. The group moved cautiously through the woods, Zeke's experience guiding them through the underbrush without leaving a trail. As they approached a dilapidated shack, Iris signaled for them to stop. "This is it," she whispered. Inside, they found a trove of incriminating evidence: ledgers listing illegal transactions, crates of weapons, and surveillance photos. Among them was a picture of Zeke's cabin, taken just days before. The discovery chilled them, but their search was cut short when Zeke spotted a tripwire near the entrance. "It's a trap," he growled, motioning for everyone to back away. They escaped just as the shack erupted in flames, a delayed explosive triggered by their movement. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Maren heard a noise outside. Clutching Sawyer to her chest, she peered through a crack in the curtains. On the porch, Sawyer's blanket was gone. "Ranger," she whispered. The dog was already at her side, ears perked. He led her to a clearing where she found another symbol carved into a tree. Beneath it, a note scrawled in jagged handwriting read, "We're watching." Her breath hitched, but she steeled herself and returned to the cabin, bolting the door behind her. By the time Zeke, Iris, and Wyatt returned, dusk had settled over the forest. Maren met them at the door, her expression a mix of relief and fear. She showed them the note, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it over. "This isn't just about Sawyer anymore," Iris said grimly. "Clay wants to make an example of all of you." Zeke examined the symbols and maps they'd gathered, a grim determination settling over him. "These marks, they're not random. They're leading us somewhere. Maddox has a base out there, and if we don't take the fight to him, he'll keep coming back until we're all dead." Wyatt squared his shoulders, his voice firm. "Then let's finish this." Zeke nodded, his gaze fixed on the dense forest. "If he wants us, he's going to have to fight for it." The cabin was quiet, save for the sound of Ranger's steady breathing as he rested at Maren's feet. Zeke spread the map across the table, his finger tracing the symbols Iris had connected. Each mark led deeper into the forest, converging on one ominous location. "This is it," Zeke said, his voice low but resolute. "This is where Clay's hiding. If we're going to stop him, we have to strike now." Maren frowned, glancing at Sawyer, who cooed softly in his makeshift crib. "And leave the cabin unguarded. What if they double back while you're gone?" "She's got a point," Wyatt interjected, though his tone lacked conviction. Zeke's eyes locked on Wyatt's. "If we don't stop him now, there won't be a safe place left to hide." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Wyatt straightened, his jaw tightening. "You're right. Let's end this." Preparing for the mission was a somber affair. Iris checked her weapon, loading it with precision, while Zeke fashioned traps and barriers to protect the cabin in their absence. Wyatt, for the first time, moved with purpose, gathering supplies and makeshift weapons. "I'll stay here with Sawyer," Maren said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Zeke hesitated. "Maren, I'll be fine," she insisted, meeting his gaze. "You've taught me enough. Just promise me. Promise me you'll come back." Zeke nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I promise." Ranger, sensing the gravity of the moment, nuzzled Maren's hand before trotting to her side, his loyalty unmistakable. The journey through the forest was a slow, tense march. The carved symbols grew more frequent, guiding them like a twisted breadcrumb trail. The trees loomed tall and shadowy, their branches clawing at the sky. Wyatt broke the silence as they neared the suspected base. "Clay didn't just target me because of the debt," he admitted. "He knew I'd never be able to fight back. That's what he does. He preys on the weak." Zeke, walking ahead, glanced back. "You're not weak now. Remember that." They reached the clearing just as night fell. The base was a haphazard encampment, blending into the dense foliage. Crates of stolen goods were stacked high, surrounded by makeshift tents and a central fire pit. Iris pulled out her camera, snapping photos. "This is enough to shut down his entire operation," she whispered. Zeke motioned for quiet as he crept toward a nearby tent. Inside, he found a folder filled with documents, ledgers, maps, and photos. One photo stopped him cold. Sawyer, swaddled in a hospital blanket with a date scribbled beneath it. "What the hell is this?" Zeke muttered, his stomach twisting. Before anyone could respond, a shout pierced the night. "Intruders!" Chaos erupted as Clay's men emerged from the shadows. Gunfire cracked through the forest, forcing Zeke, Iris, and Wyatt to take cover behind a stack of crates. "Stick together!" Iris commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Zeke and Wyatt fought side by side, their movements surprisingly coordinated. Iris, ever the tactician, directed them to higher ground, using the terrain to turn the fight in their favor. But the tide turned when one of Clay's men grabbed Wyatt, slamming him against a tree. "You're nothing but a coward," the man sneered, "and now your son's gonna pay for it." Wyatt's eyes flared with rage. With a surge of strength, he broke free, landing a solid punch that sent his captor sprawling. Zeke appeared moments later, hauling the man to his feet. "You're not that man anymore," Zeke said firmly. "Stop acting like you are." As the group gained the upper hand, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" Clay Maddox stepped into view, his expression a mix of fury and calculation. "Fall back!" he barked at his men. The remaining henchmen retreated, melting into the darkness as Clay lingered. "You think this is over?" he shouted, his voice carrying an edge of menace. "You've only just begun to see what I'm capable of." With that, he disappeared into the woods, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Back at the cabin, Maren paced the living room, Ranger watching her every move. When the group returned, her relief was palpable, though it quickly turned to concern as she noticed their battered appearances. "We found his base," Iris said, setting the evidence on the table. "But this is bigger than we thought. Clay's not just running a small-time operation. This is organized crime." Maren listened intently, then said, "We're not safe yet. Ranger's been restless all night. I think someone's still out there." Her words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. Zeke glanced at Iris, then at Wyatt. "If they want to fight," he said grimly, "we'll be ready." The cabin stood in silence, shrouded in the heavy stillness of a moonless night. The air was thick with tension, as Zeke, Iris, Wyatt, and Maren prepared for what they knew was inevitable. Zeke broke the quiet, his voice steady but firm. "We end this tonight. No more running, no more hiding." Wyatt knelt beside Sawyer's crib, his hand trembling as he gently stroked his son's hair. "No matter what happens," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "you'll always have someone to fight for you." Sawyer's tiny fingers wrapped around Wyatt's thumb, grounding him in a moment of fragile hope. Ranger's low growl broke the calm. His ears perked, and his stance shifted as if sensing the encroaching danger. Zeke moved to the window, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. "They're here," he muttered. Clay Maddox and his crew emerged from the shadows, their figures barely discernible in the faint glow of flashlights. Clay's voice boomed through a bullhorn, cold and calculating. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Hand over the boy, and no one gets hurt." Inside the cabin, Maren's grip tightened on Sawyer as she stood defiantly. "We don't negotiate with monsters," she said, her voice trembling, but resolute. Iris signaled the group to their positions. "Stick to the plan. We're stronger together." The siege began with a sudden blackout as Clay's men cut the cabin's power. The group moved quickly, lighting lanterns and fortifying their defenses. Zeke, stationed at the front, exchanged fire with the attackers, his years of training coming back to him with precision. Wyatt, despite his visible fear, held his ground. One of the traps he had set earlier, a tripwire connected to a makeshift spike, took down an intruder, giving him a brief surge of confidence. Clay's voice rang out again, this time more menacing. "You think you can stop me? I'll burn this place to the ground if I have to." Maren cradled Sawyer tightly, her eyes darting towards Zeke. "What do we do now?" Zeke's jaw tightened. "We fight." The situation escalated when Clay revealed his cruel ace, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, bound and gagged, dragged into the clearing by two of his men. "You've got one chance," he sneered. "Trade the boy, or she dies." Zeke's mind raced. Iris stepped forward, her voice steady. "We can save her, but it'll take all of us working together." The plan was risky, but their only option. Iris and Wyatt would create a diversion to rescue Clara, while Zeke and Ranger held the line at the cabin. Maren, though reluctant, agreed to stay behind to protect Sawyer. "You trust me to do this?" Wyatt asked Zeke, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Zeke placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've earned it. Iris and Wyatt moved with stealth and precision, navigating the shadows to reach Clara. A tense exchange of gunfire erupted as they freed her, but the diversion worked. Wyatt faced one of Clay's lieutenants, and after a brutal struggle, he emerged victorious, bloodied but resolute. Meanwhile, at the cabin, Clay made his move. He broke through the barricades, facing Zeke in a raw, visceral fight. The two men grappled in the dimly lit room, their grunts and the sound of fists connecting echoing through the cabin. Clay's strength and desperation made him a formidable opponent, but Zeke's experience and determination proved stronger. With Ranger's intervention, a ferocious leap that knocked Clay off balance, Zeke delivered the decisive blow, incapacitating him. As the dust settled, the faint sound of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of Iris's backup. Law enforcement stormed the area, rounding up Clay's men and securing the cabin. Clay, bloodied and defeated, spat venomous words as he was dragged away in cuffs. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You'll never be free of me." Inside, the group collapsed in exhausted relief. Marin rushed to Zeke, throwing her arms around him. "You gave us hope when we needed it most," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Wyatt, holding Sawyer close, approached Zeke. For a moment, the two men locked eyes before Zeke extended his hand. Wyatt took it, and with a firm shake, Zeke said, "You proved yourself tonight." As the cabin quieted, Ranger settled beside Sawyer, who giggled as the dog licked his tiny hand. It was a moment of lightness amidst the heaviness of the night, a reminder of what they had fought for. Iris stood at the window, her expression pensive. "We may have stopped Clay tonight, but his network is still out there. We'll need to stay vigilant." Zeke joined her, staring into the dark forest. "We're ready for whatever comes next." The night seemed to hold its breath, the victory bittersweet and the future uncertain. The morning sun broke through the remnants of storm clouds, casting a golden light over the battered cabin. The air was crisp, quiet, and heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Zeke stood on the porch, sipping his coffee, his gaze distant but resolute. Inside, Marin sat on the floor with Sawyer, watching as he giggled at Ranger's playful antics. The innocence of his laughter contrasted sharply with the memories of the night before. It was a reminder of why they had fought so hard, and why they would continue to do so. Wyatt emerged from the back room, wincing as he adjusted the makeshift bandage on his arm. Zeke noticed and gestured for him to sit. "Let me take a look," he said gruffly, grabbing a clean strip of cloth. As Zeke patched him up, Wyatt muttered, "I'm sorry for all of it. If it weren't for me, Sawyer wouldn't have been in danger in the first place." Zeke paused, meeting Wyatt's eyes. "You're here now. That's what matters. It takes guts to face your mistakes and to fight for something worth protecting." Outside, a caravan of police vehicles pulled into the clearing, disrupting the fragile peace. Iris stepped out first, her demeanor as sharp and focused as ever. Behind her, officers escorted a handcuffed Clay Maddox and his remaining crew. Clay's cold eyes locked on Zeke and Wyatt as he was loaded into a car. "You've won this round," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "But you'll never stop me." Wyatt stiffened, but Zeke placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Let him talk," Zeke said. "Words are all he has left now." Iris approached with a weary smile. "The evidence from the safe house is solid. Clay's not walking away from this one. But his network, it's bigger than we thought." Zeke nodded. "Then we keep fighting, one step at a time." As the police vehicles disappeared down the dirt road, neighbors began to arrive. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, her wrists still bruised but her spirit unbroken, carried a basket of fresh bread. "You saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't thank you enough." Others brought tools, planks of wood, and supplies to help repair the cabin. For the first time in years, Zeke felt the weight of isolation lift as the community rallied around them. "It's not just your fight anymore," Mrs. Henshaw said, her kind eyes meeting Zeke's. "We're in this together." Later that day, Wyatt sat on the porch with Sawyer in his lap. "I'm going to testify," he announced, his voice steady. "Clay needs to pay for what he's done, and I need to make things right, for him and for me." Zeke leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "It won't be easy. His lawyers will do everything they can to tear you apart." "I know," Wyatt replied, looking down at Sawyer. "But I'm done running. It's time to face it." For the first time, Zeke smiled faintly. "You've got my respect, Wyatt. You've earned it." That evening, as the group sat around a makeshift fire outside the cabin, Maren pulled out a worn notebook. She began writing a letter, her soft voice breaking the quiet. "To Sawyer," she said, glancing at the child asleep in her lap. "You've shown me what it means to fight for something worth protecting. I hope one day you'll grow up to see the strength we've all found in each other, and in you." Zeke listened quietly, the flickering firelight softening the hard lines of his face. "You've got a good heart, Maren. Don't ever lose that." Before the fire died out, the group gathered the carved symbols they had removed from the trees surrounding the cabin. Wyatt placed the final piece of wood into the flames, watching it turn to ash. "No more fear," he said firmly. "We're done being his victims." The fire burned brighter for a moment, as if sealing their collective vow. As night fell, Iris received a call on her radio. Her expression darkened as she listened. "It's a tip from my precinct," she told Zeke. "There's talk of a mole in the force working with Clay's network. We're not out of the woods yet." Zeke stared into the dark forest, his jaw tight. "Then we'll be ready. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Ranger let out a soft bark, as if in agreement, while Sawyer stirred and nestled closer to Maren. The cabin, though scarred and weathered, stood as a testament to their resilience and their resolve to keep fighting. The cabin stood proud against the backdrop of the Appalachian forest, its fresh wooden planks gleaming in the morning sun. Gone were the scars of the siege. In their place stood a symbol of resilience and renewal. 6 months had passed since the group faced Clay Maddox and his men, but the memories remained, etched into their lives like the new carvings Zeke had hung above the mantel, symbols of strength and unity. Sawyer toddled barefoot in the soft grass, his giggles filling the air as Ranger chased after him, tail wagging. Maren, tending to a small garden of tomatoes and herbs, glanced up and smiled. The sight of Sawyer's joy was a balm to her soul, a reminder of how far they had come. Wyatt stood nearby, splitting firewood with practiced ease. His face, once etched with guilt and fear, now bore a look of quiet determination. He paused, wiping his brow and watching Sawyer play. His son's laughter was the sound of redemption, a reminder of why he had fought so hard. Inside the cabin, Zeke stirred a pot of stew over the wood-burning stove. The smell of rosemary and chicken wafted through the air. He had taken to cooking more often, surprising even himself with how much he enjoyed it. A knock at the door drew his attention. Wiping his hands on a towel, he opened it to find Iris Monroe standing there, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and lingering concern. "Iris," Zeke greeted. "Good to see you." She stepped inside, carrying a folder under her arm. "Thought I'd stop by and give you an update." Zeke poured her a cup of coffee as she laid the folder on the table. "Clay Maddox was sentenced last week. 25 years without parole," she said. "Your testimony, Wyatt's, and the evidence from the safe house sealed it." Zeke nodded. "Good. He won't be hurting anyone else." Iris's expression darkened slightly. Most of his network has been dismantled, but there are loose ends. She opened the folder, showing a list of names. Some powerful people were funding his operation. "We're trying to trace the money, but it's slow going." Zeke's jaw tightened. "We'll be ready if they come back." Later that afternoon, the group gathered for a barbecue hosted by the neighbors. Smoke from the grill curled into the sky as laughter and chatter filled the clearing. Mrs. Clara Henshaw approached with a small wooden carving in her hands. "For Sawyer," she said, handing it to Maren. It was a protective symbol, carefully crafted and polished. Maren accepted it with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Henshaw. This means so much." Nearby, Sawyer squealed with delight as Ranger performed a playful leap. The dog, now fully healed and a beloved member of the family, basked in the attention. "You're my best friend, Ranger," Sawyer exclaimed, throwing his arms around the dog's neck. The moment drew smiles from everyone, a light-hearted reprieve from the weight of the past. As the celebration wound down, Iris pulled Zeke aside. Her voice was low, her tone serious. "There's something you need to see." She handed him a document from her folder. It was a financial report, highlighting suspicious transactions linked to Clay's network. Zeke scanned the paper, his brow furrowing. "This isn't over, is it?" "No," Iris admitted. "Whoever was backing him still has resources. We've traced some of it to a shell company with ties to this area." Zeke's gaze shifted to the darkening forest. "If they're coming, we'll be ready." As night fell, the group gathered around the fire pit outside the cabin. The warm glow illuminated their faces as they shared stories and laughter. Wyatt, with Sawyer on his lap, turned to Maren. "You've been writing something, haven't you?" Maren nodded and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "For Sawyer, I want him to know how we all came together and how much he's loved." She opened to a page and read aloud. "In the darkest of times we found each other, and together we became stronger than we ever thought possible. That's what family is, a light in the storm." Sawyer yawned and leaned against Wyatt's chest, his eyelids growing heavy. Ranger curled up at their feet, his presence steady and reassuring. Zeke looked around the circle, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he knew they were strong enough to face whatever came next. As the fire crackled softly, Zeke murmured, "This is home." In reflecting on this story, we see a powerful message about resilience, redemption, and the strength that comes from standing together in the face of adversity. Wyatt's journey teaches us that it's never too late to fight for what truly matters, and Zeke's transformation shows that even the most broken among us can find purpose in protecting and uplifting others. Ranger, our loyal and silent hero, reminds us of the unconditional love and courage animals bring into our lives. But this story also raises important questions. How do we forgive ourselves for past mistakes? What would you do to protect the ones you love? And how do we move forward when the shadows of the past linger in our lives? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What lessons stood out to you the most from this story? Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance like Wyatt? Let me know in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and thought-provoking tales. And hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey of courage, love, and redemption. Thank you for being part of this adventure, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts.